Hello everyone, today I want to talk about elementals versus nature spirits, Paracelsus, and so much more, so let's get into it. There will be some sources linked in the description box below for the information that I'm going to present, and this is sort of going to be a lecture / discussion because everything is up for debate here, and you'll see what I mean as we go throughout this lecture. We're going to talk about what are elementals. We're going to discuss a brief history, how they differ from nature spirits perhaps, and this is really controversial. We're going to talk about Paracelsus and also some criticisms of Paracelsus. When we get into the question, what is an elemental versus what is a nature spirit, this is where it really gets controversial and opinions may vary. And then we're going to get into part 2, which is how to and why work with these elementals. And this is really just going to be an introduction to working with elementals. It entirely depends on what magical tradition you are operating from. Obviously, in certain ceremonial magic orders, such as the Golden Dawn, there's a very specific way of working with these entities. But for folk practitioners, eclectic witches, and so on, people have been working with elementals for a really long time, and it doesn't always call for a ceremonial approach unless you are operating from one of those traditions. I know what I said is very controversial, but in this discussion, we're gonna really see how loosely and also how strict we can apply the elemental label. What inspired this video is I read 3 books recently. Over the past couple months, I've read 3 different books that completely contradicted each other as to what an elemental is and isn't. And after reading that, I kind of went through this realization because I had my own definition of what elemental spirits are. And then in going and reading these books and they are applying different definitions that I wouldn't necessarily agree with, I was able to see just how differently we all view these entities. And so this discussion is pure exploration. I invite you in the comments to, after watching the discussion, put in your own thoughts, especially if your thoughts differ from mine, because I would love to hear from you. I am also a very sensitive person though, so be nice in the comments to me, but please change my mind. I am always open to having my mind changed. And if you're watching this video in the future, 6 months from now, a year from now, whatever, my opinions on this could totally change. So what are elementals? These are spirits that are really connected to the 4 elements: fire, air, earth, and water. Sometimes there will be elementals that are connected to a spirit, quote unquote, element, but we're really just talking about the 4 elements in this particular discussion. These spirits are often believed to govern and embody the spirit of those elements. And we'll talk about that aspect a little bit more later in this video as well. So I want to start by introducing the elementals, and then we'll discuss its historical aspects and criticisms and all of that. I am going to be reading a quick definition from one of my favorite books right now. This is the Self-Initiation into the Golden Dawn Tradition. Why am I reading the definition from this book? Because I've read definitions in other books and I really do like this one the best. Also, I'm revisiting this as part of my personal practice right now, so it is just very relevant for me. But anyone interested in the Golden Dawn system that ends up finding Regardie's big black book way too daunting, definitely check out the Self-Initiation into the Golden Dawn Tradition. But I am going to be reading the elemental description from this book, and then I'm going to be applying a little bit of my own interpretations later on, and we're also going to talk about Paracelsus. So, an elemental is a non-physical entity having a nature that is composed entirely of one of the 4 magical elements. They are the invisible counterparts of visible nature, or the spiritual essence of the elements. Whereas humans, angels, archangels, and higher spiritual beings have composite natures, elementals are composed of only one etheric essence. In the spiritual realms, elementals occupy a place between human beings and higher entities such as angels and archangels. These 4 elementals are the gnomes for earth, the sylphs for air, the undines, or it's also sometimes pronounced undines, for water, and the salamanders for fire. So for the gnomes tied to the element earth, the name of these beings is derived from the Greek word genomos, meaning earth dweller. The gnomes work in an element so close in vibration to the physical earth that they have immense power over the rocks and vegetation, as well as the mineral elements in the bodily makeup of humans and animals. They work with stones, gems, and metals, and are said to be the guardians of hidden treasures. Various mythic traditions have depicted several types of gnomes, such as satyrs, brownies, elves, and dryads. Gnomes are supposed to be patient and hardworking, but can sometimes also be malicious and difficult. Because of their earth nature, they are assigned to the direction north. Now again, this is in the Golden Dawn tradition. The king of the gnomes is called Gob. The Sylphs are the spirit of air. So these beings dwell not in the physical atmosphere, but in the incorporeal spiritual substance, which is similar to the Earth's atmosphere. They are the highest group of elementals because their element has the highest vibrational rate. The wind and clouds are said to be their vehicle. Mythology usually depicts them as winged fays or fairies. The air spirits are erratic, changeable creatures that move with the speed of lightning. They work through the ethers and gases of the earth and indirectly with the human nervous system. Sylphs are beneficent, mirthful, and inspirational to humans, especially artists and poets. They are said to dwell in the clouds. They are assigned to the eastern quarter, again in the Golden Dawn tradition that is. The king of Sylphs is called Paralda and is said to dwell in the clouds surmounting the highest mountain peak. Next we get to the Undines, which are associated with the water element. Again, I've seen it pronounced Undines or Undines. I really personally prefer Undines because it makes me think of the Latin vowels, but you know, either one is probably fine. These entities function in the spiritual essence called humid or liquid ether. The vibratory rate of this substance is close to that of the element of water. Thus, the Undines are able to control and manipulate the flow of water in nature. They also work with the vital fluids in plants, animals, and humans. In mythology, Undines are given various forms, such as water nymphs, water sprites, mermaids. They are said to be vital, graceful, and generally beneficent to humans. The queen of the water spirits is called Nisha. These beings are assigned to the western quarter of creation. Not 100% sure how to pronounce Nisha. Maybe it's Nisha. I don't know. Somebody will let me know in the comments and correct my pronunciation on that. And the last elemental is the salamanders that are tied to the fire element. So salamanders are the strongest and most powerful of the elementals. The salamanders live in that spiritual ether, which is the invisible fire of nature. Physical fire and warmth cannot exist without them. The salamanders work through the emotional nature of humans and animals by means of the bloodstream and body heat. They also exert influence over all fiery tempered beings. They are said to be the most difficult of all elementals to communicate with, owing to their incinitory nature of their element. However, the smoke of burning incense is a medium for their expression. Salamanders vary in size and appearance, from fiery balls or tongues of flame to mythological armored figures and fiery lizard-like creatures. In temperament, they are dangerous and unpredictable. Their mighty king is an awe-inspiring flaming spirit known as Jinn. The salamanders are assigned to the southern quarter of creation, again as part of the Golden Dawn tradition. So where exactly did these elementals come from? Let's discuss Paracelsus a little bit further. So the concept of elemental spirits can be traced back to the teachings of Paracelsus, a 16th century Swiss alchemist, physician, and occultist. In his 16th century work, A Book on Nymphs, Sylphs, Pygmies, and Salamanders, and on Other Spirits, Paracelsus identified mythological beings as belonging to one of the four elements. He wrote the book to, quote, describe the creatures that are outside the cognizance of light of nature, how they are to be understood, what marvelous works God has created. He also states that they, the elementals, are at home in their chaos, and therefore nymphs do not drown in water, pygmies are not choked in earth, and salamanders do not burn in fire. So according to Paracelsus, these elementals are the pure embodiment of that one particular element. They do not possess an immortal soul, and they do not have a physical body. And these beings are not symbolic representations of the elements. They're actual beings that you can call upon. They are part of a much larger system that ties the material world to the spiritual world. The elementals are described as half human, half spirit. Think of a gnome that's actually able to travel through rocks and through earth terrain. They supposedly live completely in their respective elements. So an earth elemental, a gnome, is going to live in earth, in rock, in that terrain. And because these elementals can move through their own element, they have different characteristics. So the sylphs, for example, the sylphs are assigned the element air, right? They move through air very similarly to how a human would move through air, but they would burn in fire. They would not be able to move through earth. They would not be able to move through water. They would get stuck in earth. They'd burn in fire, and they would drown in water. So the Sylphs being tied to the air element, that is the element that they embody. That is the element that they can travel through. And the same goes for the respective elementals. Paracelsus says that humans are composed of three parts: an elemental body, a sidereal spirit, and an immortal divine soul. Elementals have no immortal soul. However, by marriage, according to Paracelsus, by marriage with a human being, the elemental and its offspring could gain a soul. I don't personally know how I feel about this, and I don't know if I really agree here, but there are elemental books that will spin off this and discuss all these possibilities of elementals being able to evolve over time. Some people majorly agree with that, some people majorly disagree with that. Let's talk about some criticisms of Paracelsus. So the specific elemental beings that Paracelsus described were largely his own innovation, and critics really do argue that his taxonomy lacks clear lineage within Western esotericism. The next point of criticism is that Paracelsus's elementals are often depicted with characteristics that seem arbitrary or lack explanation. Paracelsus, despite his radical views for his time, still framed his elementals within a Christian context. So he sometimes associated them with souls or spirits in need of salvation. This contrasts with a more animistic or pagan perspective on nature spirits found in folk traditions. And finally, another criticism is that Paracelsian elementals were massively influential, but in later magical traditions, they were simplified or adjusted. In Theosophy or Golden Dawn magic, for instance, they seem to reinterpret the elementals from Paracelsus's original vision. So let's give a brief timeline, a brief history of how this came to be in the occult community. Beginning with Paracelsus in the 16th century, he introduced the concepts of the four elementals. Then we have the Golden Dawn, late 19th century, that expanded and systemized this really. Then we have Gerald Gardner adapting these ideas into Wicca, which really affected the modern witchcraft community. Gerald Gardner is the founder of Wicca, for those not aware, in the mid-20th century, and he was deeply influenced by the Golden Dawn and its teachings. And then Wicca went on to influence the entire witchcraft scene. And even in reading some older occult books, we recently in my book club, we read a book, Initiation into Hermetics, I think it was actually more than a couple months ago, by Franz Bardon, which is a total staple in the occult community, right? And even he talks about elementals and working with them from his own personal perspective, his own personal gnosis. He discusses his astral trips and such, and even his approach is going to differ from the Golden Dawn more ceremonial magic approach. So it all began with Paracelsus, but then it was woven into so many other magical traditions by way of the Golden Dawn, then into Wicca, and into so many other practices from there. But it gets a little confusing in the context of cunning folk or folk magic traditions, where they've been working with elemental spirits for a really long time. There's mythology, there's stories about this entity that lives by the river, and there's arguments over, is that an elemental or is that a nature spirit? So now we're caught up to these modern interpretations, and I really want to talk about elementals versus nature spirits. So elementals, from a modern perspective, are really seen as these beings or spirits that are intermediaries between the human and the elements themselves: earth, water, air, and fire. They are the embodiment of one specific element. For example, gnomes being the pure embodiment of earth, the sylphs being the pure embodiment of air, undines being the perfect embodiment of water, and salamanders being the embodiment of fire. This directly contrasts nature spirits, because nature spirits are generally used as a much larger umbrella to encompass many different types of spirits. And we're going to talk about this in a moment, but elementals could be considered a type of nature spirits, but not all nature spirits are elementals. For example, you may have a nature spirit that is tied to not just one particular element, but multiple elements. Maybe you have a spirit that is tied to both earth and water, or fire and earth. That would not typically be considered an elemental, because it is not the pure embodiment of one specific elemental. Now, this is where it gets really tricky, because I've read some books that disagree with that claim and other books that support this claim. So nature spirits, again, are a much larger umbrella term that can encompass plant spirits, tree spirits, animal spirits, land spirits that are tied to multiple elements, not just one element in particular, such as a spirit associated with both earth and water. Another way to compare and contrast these two entities is that nature spirits are very specific to one location, whereas elementals are not. And I'd like to explain that a little bit further. So what that means is that a nature spirit resides in one particular area or region, but an elemental spirit can be conjured anywhere because they are the representations of earth, air, fire, and water that exist all around us. What I mean by this is that nature spirits are the quote unquote localized spirits of nature, while elementals represent the more fundamental and universal aspects of the natural world. So under the big umbrella of nature spirits, again, we could have plant spirits, land spirits that are tied to the folklore of that particular region. If you think of a cactus, for example, a cactus is a great example of this because it's a plant spirit. I would consider it a nature spirit, but it really has ties to both earth and fire for me personally, although I know others that would support this as well. But if you think about a cactus that grows in the desert, it is very hardy and it does grow from the earth, so obviously tied to the earth element, but there is a fire aspect to cactus as well. The characteristics of cactus and the way that it lives and grows is very fire-esque versus a lily pad. A lily pad that grows in a pond could be a combination of the earth element and the water element. And that's just plant spirits, not even getting into other spirits that could be considered nature spirits. Do you want to know my true honest opinion? I think it is completely, utterly pointless to try to put spirits like this into distinctive categories and then argue why we are right versus not right because we are just observers of this world. And so whether elementals are the same thing as nature spirits or whether they differ or whatever, at the end of the day, does it really matter? No, not really. Sometimes when we spend so much time over rationalizing things and getting really critical with the way that we're categorizing things, the more it actually takes you away from spiritually experiencing these things. So feel free to develop your own personal gnosis on this. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments as to everything that we've discussed thus far. So let's talk modern interpretations a little bit more when it comes to elemental spirits. How can these be viewed? Because there are so many different perspectives. Yes, if we can all agree that elementals are the pure embodiment of one particular element, what does that mean? What do you mean? We're going to talk about different perspectives. So the first perspective is that some people may view elementals as the perfect embodiments, again, of the elements themselves. In this perspective, these spirits are seen not as separate beings, but as manifestations or personifications of the core qualities of the elements. A salamander would not simply be a spirit of fire, but a literal embodiment of fire's energy, heat, transformation, power. And similarly, undines would not only represent water, but embody its qualities of fluidity, emotion, intuition, so on and so forth. They are essentially the purest form of their respective elements, and they serve as the intermediaries between the human and the elements. Now, if we were to look at them like nature spirits or guardians of the elements, kind of blurring those lines between elementals and nature spirits, another perspective is to see elementals as a subcategory of nature spirits or guardians who oversee and protect these forces of nature. So in this view, elementals serve as caretakers. They ensure balance and harmony of their respective elements within the physical world. Some may not believe in any of this at all and may choose to view elementals as psychological archetypes. So in more modern and psychological interpretations, particularly after the rise of Carl Jung's psychological archetypes, elementals can be seen as archetypes of the unconscious mind, representing different aspects of human experience and psychic states. So for example, again, salamanders relating to fire might represent passion or willpower within yourself, within your psyche, or within the collective psyche. So in this view, elementals are a way to connect to the inner self or the collective unconscious, really accessing deep psychological energies that can lead to perhaps self-discovery, personal transformation, emotional healing. We might view these as beings on the astral plane or the spirit realm. These spirits may not be bound by the laws of physics, existing on a different plane of reality completely, where they interact with the energy of these elements. They might be invoked during rituals to bring in that elemental energy into the material physical world for whatever purpose your ritual has. From the chaos magic perspective, your belief is what matters. Your belief powers your magical workings and it adjusts the reality that you see and experience. So whether these beings live in the fourth dimension dimension, whether these beings are objectively real, whether they're psychological archetypes, whether they are an astral entity that is the perfect embodiment of the element, whatever. It doesn't matter. It does not matter, because from the chaos magic lens, your belief in these entities and working with them is all that matters to get the job done. So if you want to work with the earth element and you decide to call upon the gnomes in your ritual, or if you want to sit down and work with fire and you want to call upon the salamander for its intelligence of this element, who cares what sort of category this spirit falls under? And finally, we also have an animistic perspective. So these elementals can be seen as these living conscious beings that embody the essence of the natural world. So in animism, for those that are not familiar, everything, plants, rocks, animals, even the elements themselves, they are alive. They have their own spirit, soul, or consciousness. And you as the practitioner are able to actually interact with them as if they were a sentient being, because from the animistic perspective, they are. In this view, working with these elemental beings involves really acknowledging their existence and engaging with them in a way that honors their autonomy rather than just seeking to control or command them. Let's do an even deeper dive into these elementals and discuss what each one rules over. Now, again, just keep in mind, depending on the magical tradition that you're operating from, the correspondences for these elementals might differ. What I've put together in this video really is a combination of the things I've seen from many different sources. So I want to start with a table of correspondences from 777, and it shows how the elementals are attributed to different parts of the body. So we've got the Sylphs for the air element ruling over respiratory organs. We have the Undines with the water element ruling over the organs of nutrition. The Salamanders with the fire element ruling over the organs of circulation, and the gnomes with the earth element ruling over excretory organs and skeleton. Are you ready for a whole video essay that I've prepared for you? Let's go, starting with the gnomes. So the earth elementals, the gnomes, they embody stability, grounding, nurturing, and material abundance. They represent the physical world, the foundation of life, the material realm. They're tied to growth, fertility, nourishment, and the solid, tangible aspects of existence. So I wrote down some symbols here for earth. Feel free to pause the screen if you want to read all of these. Again, these correspondences may change just depending on the practice that you're operating from. Then we get to the air elementals, the Sylphs. They embody intellect, communication, thought, freedom, movement. They're associated with ideas, mental clarity, creativity, and communication. Air is ever moving, invisible, intangible, and it represents the breath of life and the flow of consciousness. Again, I have a whole list here of air symbols that you might choose to use in your rituals or just, symbolic representations. Getting to the fire elementals, the salamanders, they embody transformation, passion, energy, action, and destruction. Fire is this force of change. It purges, it transforms everything. It is both destructive and creative. It represents willpower, strength, assertion, and this ability to transform. Again, here is a list of symbols that I have down for the fire elementals. Again, feel free to pause your screen to read. Then we get to the water elementals, the Undines, or sometimes pronounced the Undines. They embody emotion, intuition, adaptability, healing, and fluidity. Water does represent the flow of life, the subconscious, emotions, and this ever-changing nature of existence. So they are associated with cleansing, nurturing, healing, often linked to the feminine and the unconscious mind. They can also be used for magic, divination, the unseen or unknown underworld of mystery. And finally, some symbols here for the Undines that you can use in your rituals or as, again, symbolic representations. Now that we've talked about correspondences, what are some simple ways that someone can begin working with elemental beings? This is going to be a very controversial take. There are so many different ways that you can connect with the elements and the elementals, especially with simple daily practices. When we're talking about elemental magic, it really can be elementary. Elemental being elementary, anyways, can be very, very simple. My controversial take is that I really do feel like the best way to connect with elemental beings is through divination. And let me explain why. Paracelsus consistently attributes the elemental beings to being this entire wealth of knowledge of that particular element. They are often described as almost a limitless wealth of knowledge. In Liber de Nymphs, he states that they also know all future affairs, present affairs, and the past, which are not apparent but are hidden. So I do think one of the best ways to start working with elemental beings is to do divination with them. And we're going to talk about meditation too shortly. But for those that are beginners, divination is often seen as working with tarot cards, pendulums, runes, oracle cards, things of that nature, or scrying to perhaps receive messages or divine wisdom, to glean a prophecy, if you will. But there's many different ways to perform it, right? So for earth elementals, you could do stone casting. You could collect a set of sticks and stones and have the shapes of those things represent different messages. And then when you do a stone casting, it is similar to bone throwing, where you then read how it lays after throwing. You could also use the pendulum. The pendulum is assigned to the gnomes, the earth elementals. You could work with your tarot cards and just work with the pentacle suit, because the gnomes are tied to the pentacles in tarot. And you could also do dirt scrying. This is something I do often when I work with the gnomes in my garden space. And for those that have been on my channel for a while, I've worked with the gnomes for the past 3 years now and have had incredible results in my garden space. And I'll often do dirt scrying, and it's very, very simple. I have a whole video on how to scry. I will link that in the description box if you're curious, because we're going to be talking a lot about scrying in this next little 5-minute segment. But dirt scrying, you would simply look at the dirt that is around you and scry for images. So if you're not familiar with that, again, go check out the scrying video that I did. For air elementals, the Sylphs, you could easily scry into clouds or into incense smoke. I know incense smoke is a little bit of a gray area, especially when it's close to the ember, because that could also be considered the salamander. The salamander can also be seen through incense smoke, but I do believe the Sylphs can be seen in any sort of smoke, from a campfire, from incense, whatever. You could do feather divination. You could also do bibliomancy. So bibliomancy is where you select a book, open to a random page, and read out the message that the universe has given you. Other divination methods with the Sylphs can also include numerology, augury, even sound divination. When a song comes on the radio and you sit in your car and it plays a line that perfectly answers your question, or even sound divination with singing bowls, that's something that you can look into. And of course, working with the swords suit, specifically in tarot. So the swords in tarot are linked to the Sylphs. Getting to the fire elementals, the salamanders, the best way to do divination with the salamanders is obviously through fire, through a candle flame, through the flames of a bonfire. If you're sitting around camping and you're all staring into the embers and doing some scrying that way. Again, you can do it through the smoke of the incense. That smoke is really a gray area between the Sylphs and the salamanders. The salamanders are also connected to the wands suit in tarot. So if you wanted to just work with the wands to pull a message from that suit, you can certainly do that. With the water elementals, the undines, of course there is water scrying. I've even done I did a video a while ago where it was candle wax scrying into a bowl of water, and it was almost a combination of working with the fire element with the candle and also water at the same time, because you're watching the candle wax drip into the water and how it moves and takes shape. So that is something that you can do to connect with the undines. I know there's a little bit of a fire element there with the candle, but you're really focusing on the candle wax hitting the water and the messages that are coming from the water, potentially, not necessarily the candle. I also think dream interpretation, dream incubation, anything to do with dreams when it comes to the water element, the undines, is going to be very, very helpful. And also the cups in tarot. They are assigned the cups suit in tarot if you wanted to work with it that way. Lastly, mirror scrying. Because there is this reflective quality with water, I do think that mirror scrying is a fantastic way to connect with the undines. After performing divination and potentially receiving some messages and just getting a little bit more familiar with working with that type of element, specifically in a divination sense, I also think it's important to meditate and meet these entities on the astral realm. I know that sounds very chaos magic. There's so many different traditions that do a version of this. Even in Franz Bardon's work with Initiation into Hermetics, he talks about his own experiences sort of on the astral working with these entities. So if you like visualization, you can go on a visualization journey to their domain. There's many meditations online that you could do to travel to their domain in your mind, or maybe slightly outside your mind. You know what I mean. But you could also make up your own visualization. So maybe in your mind, maybe you travel to the ocean for the Undines. Maybe for the Sylphs, you travel to this castle up in the clouds that is very airy and there's no solid structure to it, and you can almost like travel through it. Maybe you visualize going down a staircase into the dirt, into a couple layers of the earth, into this hidden forest for connecting with the gnomes. Or maybe you visualize a fire temple for the salamanders. So there's a lot of play here, especially if you're operating from a non-ceremonial approach. I'm not saying it has to be a chaos magic approach by any means, but from a non-ceremonial magic approach, there's a lot of opportunity for meditation with these types of entities. A couple quick notes here. Paracelsus does warn that the elementals are morally neutral and they might deceive or mislead you without proper magical authority. I personally think this is the case with any spiritual being you're attempting to contact, so be responsible. If you're brand new to working with spirits in general, I do have a video, it's literally titled How to Work with Spirits, and it really just kind of talks about the basics, how to protect yourself and things like that. Don't assume that all spirits are here to help you or all beings are here to help you, because that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes they could care less about you. The Golden Dawn, for example, really insists on having strong psychic boundaries and really just a lot of ethical preparation before attempting to work with any sort of spirit or being. Again, do your research, and if you want to go the ceremonial magic route, maybe you choose to pick up the Golden Dawn, or maybe you decide to follow a different tradition. Now, if we are talking about a very nature-based, eclectic, pagan, animistic perspective, working with elementals, not ceremonial magic, I do think there are very easy practical things that you can do to also start connecting with these elementals beyond divination and beyond meditation. So for example, with earth, the gnomes, you can do grounding exercises. So spend some time walking barefoot on the earth, sitting with your back to a tree, connecting to the stability of earth. You could garden. This is primarily how I connect to the gnomes, but planting and really caring for the plants around you help to embody the nurturing and growth aspects of the earth. And also the gnomes just really appreciate it. The gnomes appreciate when you care about the land that you live on. Maybe you decide to connect to some rocks, stones, or crystals, and you work with them, you bring them in your pockets places, you go on nature walks, spend some time outdoors, maybe appreciate the mountains you live next to, the forests, or any landforms that you feel connected to. Also eating root vegetables. So eating root vegetables like carrots, potatoes, beets, these are really connected to the earth's grounding energy, anything that grows in the dirt. For the sylphs connected to the air element, there are various breathing exercises. Any sort of breath work can really connect you to the sylphs. You could sing, do chanting, engage in vocal exercises, wind exposure, standing outside in the wind, connecting to the four directions of the winds. There's a lot of witchcraft traditions specifically that talk about the four winds, where you have the north wind, the east wind, south, and west, and they all represent different things. You could journal or write. Air, again, is tied to intellect and ideas, so writing regularly could help you channel this energy, and you could do a little bit of automatic writing with that. Using incense or fans, of course, to symbolize the flow and movement of air within your space. Then we get to the salamanders, again, associated with fire. Sunlight exposure is an excellent practical daily practice. So spend some time basking in the sun. You can exercise or dance. Physical activity in general, especially anything that really makes you sweat, is fantastic for working with the salamanders. Candles, light some candles in your space or meditate by candlelight to connect with the creative and energetic power of fire. Spicy foods, incorporate spicy foods into your meals to energize and stimulate this inner fire. And lastly, the undines with water. Drink lots of water. Stay hydrated. Okay, we are made up of so much water. Drinking plenty of water throughout the day really helps you connect to the water element, and bathing or ritual baths or swimming, spending any amount of time in water, especially when it comes to maybe a cleansing ceremony, a purification ceremony, or something that is meant to heal, would be very appropriate. Listening to rain or water sounds. If it's raining outside, create a soothing atmosphere with the sounds of rain. Maybe you like to sit next to a river or listen to ocean waves to help you relax and open up your intuition. Also, emotional journaling. I know I talked about this with the sylphs that, rule over the air element, but this also applies here with emotional journaling specifically for the undines when you're writing your feelings, connecting to water's fluid, reflective qualities, going into your subconscious mind a little bit. And there are also plenty of offerings offerings that you can leave for these entities as well. You know, let's say you decide to build up an elemental altar, not just for the elements, but the elemental beings associated with each element, and you want to leave them specific offerings. I'm going to insert a little bit of personal bias here, so take it or leave it. I don't personally feel like altars are received as well by the elementals. There are certain entities that I've worked with, certain spirits or beings or whatever we want to categorize them. Some of them enjoy altars and some of them don't really care. For example, when I've worked with angels in the past, angelic beings, they've never really seemed to care if I have an altar dedicated to them. It's not like a deity, a god or a goddess where you are worshiping them, or maybe your ancestors where you're venerating them on a regular basis. The elementals, in my experience, don't want to be worshipped or venerated. It's not that type of relationship. They are the intermediaries between you and the elements themselves. They are not a god, they're not a goddess, they're not something to be worshipped. They are beings to have relationships with, almost similar to having a relationship with a friend. Just keep in mind that sometimes they're not going to care about you, and it is up to you to show that you are somebody worth having a relationship with. So in conclusion, there are so many different ways that we can classify elementals. If we are starting with Paracelsus and his 4 categories, right? And then we even have gnomes and brownies and things of that nature that can fall under the gnome category. But then you have some people that are saying that the gnomes found in folklore are not necessarily the same gnomes that Paracelsus is talking about. So then this gets into a whole nother gray area, because so many people over time and space have made different categories for these spirits, and they don't neatly, perfectly fit into other people's categories. So I want to know your thoughts. I want to hear your thoughts, especially when it comes to working with these elementals. I want to know what you've done, what has worked, what hasn't worked, how do you view these entities? It is totally up for debate and discussion. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned something. I'll see you in the next one.